Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sofus. Then for the next speaker, we have Sietze. Sietze, when you're ready, the floor is yours.
So hello everybody. Great to be here and meet all of you in the virtual world. Yeah, and thanks a lot, as other speakers said. Thanks a lot for inviting me. Yeah, I will talk about anticipated post-growth effects of on island biodiversity. Yeah, so I already saw that Kenneth is actively tweeting. So yeah, great to have that out there. Yeah, so what I will talk about is two things. So one, yeah, about global change and how this manifests at the local scale, and I will yeah, highlight particularly the role of islands. I'll briefly talk about the Anthropocene and the sixth mass extinction. That's the first part of my talk. And then in the second part, I will talk about two case studies. I present two case studies about island socio-ecological systems. And I will mainly discuss historical legacy, so how the present state of island ecosystems and island biodiversity yeah, is affected by yeah, activities in the past. And I'll also talk about spatial substitution. And that will become clear later what I mean with that. So yeah, so the Anthropocene, a lot of people talk about it. There's a lot, there's a great search in the literature about this concept. So and there's also a lot of controversy about it. I will not talk about that here today. That will take another lecture. But the basic idea that yeah, human impacts on the natural environment, on biodiversity, have become so large that we have entered a new geological epoch, a new chapter in Earth's history, you could say. And we have all seen these kind of figures, these hockey stick curves, where the water use, fertilizer consumption, the number of McDonald's restaurants have exponentially increased over the last decades to centuries. But there are two things with this. So one, we generally talk about the Anthropocene as a global phenomenon and as a recent phenomenon. But of course, these changes that we are now witnessing at the global scale, they have their roots at the local scale, at human environment interactions at the local scale, and which even go back in time, yeah, thousands and perhaps even 10,000 years. So it's really a continuum, a cumulative increase of yeah, human impacts on the environment. So why I put these umbrellas here? So the Anthropocene is really an umbrella term, which makes it sometimes difficult to acknowledge these regional differences, both in the onset of human activities, human impacts, and also in their extent. So I think that if we want to understand human environment interactions, we should go, I think, a bit back and forth between the global and the local scale. So how do these global changes manifest at the local scale, and how do they differ between localities? So in that regards, islands are ideal study sites because we have also many replicates, many different ways in which societies have developed, and also yeah, many different environmental conditions. So I think there's a lot we can learn from islands in that regards. Also, if we think about island biodiversity, so islands contribute disproportionately to global biodiversity. If you look at the figure on the left, you see, well, okay, this might be counterintuitive, because if you look at islands, the top map on the left, map A, you see that the species number, so species richness, is generally lower on islands than it is on continents, so fewer species. However, those species that do occur on these islands are often endemic species, so which means that they do not occur outside of a particular island or archipelago. And as a result, because these species are unique, they contribute a lot to global biodiversity. So if you look on the right, on the bar on the right, so I quote here, so islands make up about 5% of Earth's land surface, but an estimated 17% of plant species, 19% of bird species, 17% of rodents, and as well 27% of human languages. So consequently, the density of species and languages on islands is higher than on continents. So this is really why I think if we want to conserve biodiversity at a global scale, we should really also focus on islands. We should put our attention on islands. However, islands are also at the forefront of global extinctions. So if we look at recent extinctions over the past century, so I'm only talking about recorded extinctions, of course, about 60% of all extinctions worldwide were island species. So islands are really, in the hotspots of the current ongoing biodiversity crisis. So if we now move from islands again up to the global scale, there's a lot of talk about the sixth mass extinction. So if we talk about sixth mass extinction, there's good news and there's bad news. So let me start with the bad news. So the current rate at which species are wiped off from the face of the earth is much larger than background rates. So if we look at the past millions of years, really the rate at which species are currently disappearing is huge. It's really worrying. However, the definition of a mass extinction event is when it's also about the magnitude of extinction. So if we look at the previous 5 mass extinctions, they say, okay, about 75% of species disappeared. So the previous extinction, when the dinosaurs disappeared, it was the 5th mass extinction. So we are not there. We are far from there. But of course, we need now then to change the course. So the good news is that there is still room to prevent that from happening, and we really should slow down the rates of extinction. And again, I want to emphasize we should focus on islands. So then I was doubting how to continue this. Okay, so one thing I think okay, I can now talk about successful conservation examples on islands. And I thought, well, maybe that's not what I'm going to do. So I wrote a book. It's only in Dutch, unfortunately, about human environment interactions on islands, and there I give some examples. But I was thinking, maybe better for this symposium is to talk about more conceptually. So what do we need to consider? So there are 3 couplings we need to take into account. So socio-ecological couplings, so human environment interactions, temporal couplings, so these are historical legacies, and telecouplings. I saw that Yuri held his hand up 5 minutes. So I started 23. Yeah, okay, so 5 minutes. Okay. And telecoupling, so historical, spatial substitution. So these are things we need to consider. And let me give you some examples. So for example, the first case studies on Mauritius. So soils really are the foundation of an ecosystem, and also about for the ecosystem services that are provided to society. But the quality of the soil is is reduced due to land use and habitat change, and which also undermines a society's capacity to provide, for example, food or other to use other ecosystem services. And also historical land use, where we are dealing with the legacies of the past. So here, Mauritius is an island 800 kilometers east of Madagascar. It's been settled about 400 years ago and subsequently claimed by different colonial powers, European powers, and it's mainly used to extract resources for Europe, and in this case, mainly sugarcane. And over time, the amount of native vegetation decreased, and the amount of sugarcane agriculture increased as a result, and also the amount of soil loss really drastically increased. So what I did, I modeled the amount of soil loss since first human settlement and compared this to a hypothetical situation in which the island would have never been settled by humans, because of course, soil loss is a natural process. It's also happening under natural conditions, but of course this is balanced by soil formation. But my results show that the amount of soil lost due to land use change exceeds the natural background rates by 5 times. So if we're talking about biodiversity loss, we should not only talk about the loss of species and how the rate of species loss compares to background rates, but also the conditions for ecosystems, the landscape. All of these aspects are affected by human activities. So we have to take into account these historical legacies, not only biodiversity, but also in interactions with other aspects, for example, with the landscape and soils. But then there was one thing I noted, is that it seems that those areas closer to the coast, in low-lying areas, were deforested earlier than less accessible areas in the mountains, in higher areas. So then I wanted to see whether that also holds for other islands. So I compared 30 islands in the Eastern Atlantic and looked at their societal conditions, their economic history, their landscape, their climate. So I will not go into this in much detail. But I compared different topographic, climatic, societal characteristics of each of these islands and looked at these in a statistical analysis, and also in a more qualitative comparison between these islands. And again, because due to the time, I will quickly go through it. But so each of these islands has a really different socioeconomic history. Some of these were more self-sufficient in terms of food productions, while others imported a lot of their foodstuffs. And of course, these changed also over time. And also we see that some of these islands were used by European powers to extract resources, while others were more self-sustaining. But regardless of these very different socioeconomic histories, it turned out that the landscape and the ruggedness of the islands really affected the extent of human impacts. I'm a bit confused because of the time. I thought I had 20 minutes, so I have to really rush a bit through it. And there's one thing. So how can these islands have, for example, if you think about Mauritius, how can that still persist? And of course, as Iago also mentioned in his talk, ecosystem services can be substituted. We live in a global economy, so there's really a decoupling between island societies and local ecosystems. Yeah. So yeah, let me jump to the conclusions. So yeah, what can we learn then from islands? So if we talk about the Anthropocene and global environmental change and local human impacts, there's a great diagraneity, so different in the onset of human impacts, and also if we compare, just if we think about climate change, some regions become much hotter than others, some become much wetter, or other become much drier. So these are things we need to take into account. So really go back and forth between the local and the global scale. So islands deserve particular attention in terms of biodiversity conservation, because they are global hotspots of endemic biodiversity and they have great conservation potential. Yeah, and biodiversity conservation strategies should account for historical legacies, so also past economic activities and how regions were used, and also take into account spatial substitution, what Iago also mentioned already. So we cannot think about islands as being isolated. So in the past, there's this analogy of viewing islands as models for the Earth, or there's been a lot of talk about island Earth, but I think the metaphor of a world archipelago is more suitable, because it acknowledges these interactions over vast distances between different locations, and it also emphasizes that what happens at the local scale can really contribute to, in this case, global biodiversity conservation, for example, and islands are really an example of that. Yeah, so that was what I wanted to tell you. It's a bit rushed, but yeah, if you want to learn more, please read the book. Yeah.
Thank you, Sietze. Excellent talk. I see that there is a first question by Kenneth.
Yeah, Sietze, thank you so much for your presentation and providing an island perspective. So you have analyzed, the effects of the impacts of actually globalization on these islands with the various socioeconomic trajectories. So each island had their own history. And then you actually conclude that landscape facilitates the exploitation on these islands. Do you see that it could also help to conserve nature, the landscape traits?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from this comparison of these 30 islands, it really seemed that those islands that were less accessible, or maybe also less suitable for human land use, were also the ones that were least converted. So they had the largest remaining area of native vegetation cover. And this is also in line with other studies that show that nature conservation areas are often located in least accessible areas. So these are things we should, I think, also take into account, that it's not only about conscious decisions, or well, maybe it is, but it's also really about what is easy for us. So it seems that we also take the easy path in which places we conserve and which ecosystems we conserve. Yeah. So and it also shows that it's really not only about human behavior or economic decisions or policy, but also about how also we are still, I mean, we are also a species, right? So and we are not, in that regards, I mean, we are also affected by our environment and the climate, etc. So it's good to, if we are more conscious about that. I mean, why do people take the elevator and not the stairs? It's I mean, if you enter the building and there's a stairs in front of you, you take the stairs. If there's an elevator, you take the elevator. And it works a bit the same, I think, with where we decide to do. I mean, it's maybe
Deforestation.
it's also shaped by environmental conditions. Maybe that's what I want to say. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that also links to this idea of the ego and the role of the ego. Iago actually highlights, and to me it's an eye-opener too, is that our egos are shaped, of course, by the spaces we build and the social conditions and adaptations. And if we indeed have an elevator, we take the elevator. If we have a car, we rather drive than cycle 10 minutes. And yeah, so it's very interesting to see this connection, perhaps.
Thank you. Thank you, Kenneth and Sietze.
Thank you, Sietze.